and welcome back to my program. I was up in Boston. I'd done a cruise from Quebec, Canada, down around through Bal Harbour, Maine, and down to Canada last week, and came into Boston, picked up the newspaper, and saw quite a headline. The headlines in the paper said Boston sinking into the sea, and it said Boston could become the next Venice, is what the papers blared out. What's going on up in Boston? Well, there is the rising sea is what's happening every year in the Boston area along the East Coast. The sea comes up about an inch a year. Now, that doesn't sound like very much, but if you do it over 100 years, you can see the factors there, particularly concerning the fact that you don't have a lot of levees and dikes along the East Coast like we do down in Louisiana. New Orleans, for example, down where I live, is completely under sea level. Did you know that? If you're down the French Quarter, you can see the ships go above you because you're 3 feet below sea level. But the levees have been built, and there's massive pumps that pump the rainwater that come into the bowl that is formed in that part of the state, and the water is dumped back over. So similar to what happens in Holland, they have big seawalls, and they have pumps that pump out the water. It's hard to do that in the East Coast unless you put a massive sum of money there, because you don't have the seawalls, you don't have levees up that way. Now, how widespread is this problem? If you look at the studies, it's very widespread. Not only is Boston affected, look at what Hurricane Sandy did when the New York tornado came into that area, the hurricane came in. There were parts of lower Manhattan down around Wall Street that were 8 and 9 feet underwater. So that area is very susceptible. Baltimore has huge exposure to these growing threats of rising water and the potential of hurricanes. Of course, down in Florida, Miami is very much at risk where they're located. The Everglades, if you're going to save the Everglades, there's massive erosion down there. Those folks need about 40 to 50 billion, not million, billion dollars to adequately protect the Everglades. And of course, down where I live, down in South Louisiana, that whole area has been at risk for a number of years. You know that an entire football of land falls off into the ocean, is gone, not every year, not every month, not every week, every hour with football field versus of land into the Gulf of Mexico. Very serious problem. At the present rate, if nothing's done, a good bit of South Louisiana, you folks that aren't throughout this part of the country may have heard of these towns: Houma, Morgan City, areas below New Orleans, Plaquemine Parish. All that area is going to be completely underwater. No one will be living there at all unless there's some massive effort undertaken. Now, it comes down to cost. How do you pay for it? I know there was a study done, I think 25 years ago, saying that 15 billion would be a great beginning point. That was 25 years ago. Today, state officials are saying 50 billion, but a number of very reputable scientists are saying that's not going to touch it. If you don't spend $100 billion on mitigation down that way throughout South Louisiana, you're just not going to save it. Well, is it worth saving? And that's the decision we're going to have to make in a lot of these areas. I guess I would argue, and I'm a little parochial because I live down this way, but if you've got the largest oil and gas production in the country, the largest seafood production, the largest sulfur production, when you have all of the chemical industry, the largest concentration of the chemical industry along the Mississippi River there, then the economic impact would show it's worth saving. And so that makes sense. Now, did the Everglades make sense? We'd love to keep the Everglades. It's a huge wild area, second only to the wetlands in South Louisiana. What price do we pay? Is it worth 50 to 75 billion dollars to save the Florida Everglades? People down in that areas would say, yes, of course it is. We've got to save them. It's a national treasure. Others would say, well, in the list of priorities we have in this country today, it's not worth spending that kind of money. In Louisiana, down where I live, there are several sources of funding that are being talked about for the first time now, where you may be able to come up with significant sums of money. BP, the damage they did to our coast, there are informed people that tell me there could be $5 to $7 billion in a BP settlement to the state to mitigate all the damage they did, the environmental damage they did to the coast. There's an idea that is being resurrected. Governor Dave Treen, a very conservative Republican governor back in the 1980s, suggested called a quail tax, a coastal wetlands oil and gas tax on new production. The idea is that, look, we know you're going to do some damage when the oil companies come in. So in advance, we're going to charge you for that damage. Now you say, why the oil companies? Why are you picking on them? Well, if you look at the coastline, there are some 10,000 miles of canals crossing this whole wetlands. And what happened when you cut it through a canal, you disturb the whole infrastructure that was protecting those wetlands. So there's no doubt that the oil industry did a great deal of damage to the marsh, to the coast, with all the cutting through of all these thousands of miles of channels. Now, there's a lawsuit going on right now challenging them to pay for their damage. You did the damage, you got to fess up and pay. Oil industry says, well, we were playing by the rules. You didn't sue us yet, so if there was some damage, we'll talk about going forward. I don't think that's going to wash. An overwhelming majority of people in Louisiana want to have a settlement, want the oil industry to cough up, and if they're responsible for certain amounts of damage, they ought to pay for it. What I think will happen is you may have a global settlement. You have a number of companies that will pitch in to settle the case and make it go away. Now, if they pitch in and the figure is something like $30 billion, then maybe that's worth talking about. Sounds like a lot of money, but in the scheme of things, when oil companies can make billions down here in a year's time, it really isn't all that much, particularly when you consider the fact that they can deduct from their income taxes any settlement that they make with the state of Louisiana. So the quail tax, a future tax, BP, and those are the three sources, BP, and then the lawsuit that where you might have a settlement of the three sources, I think could go a long way in helping the Louisiana situation. And that's something that is being discussed at length right now in terms of what direction the state takes to save this part of the country. And that's the discussion we're going to have over Miami, over Baltimore, over Boston, over New York. How far do we go in spending to save those areas? What's the economic impact? And that's where the federal government has really dropped the ball. There's been no effort to come in and try to do a master plan to save these areas that have huge natural resources, but often have massive plant production. As I said, in Louisiana, the chemical industry, the massive number of companies that are located up and down the Mississippi River. There's a huge economic impact. And if all that's going to go by the wayside because of flooding in the future, we better do something about it. So I share that with you. That's the focus, by the way, my column I wrote this week. You can read my column by going to this website. If you're watching this video on the website, just click new column up in the upper left-hand corner, or the red flashing box above talks about Jim's column. It'll take you right there. If not, you can go to my website at www.jimbrown.usa.com. A serious problem. We're trying to put it on the front burner. We've got to talk about it because it's not going away. Thanks for tuning in. We'll come right back.